Congratulations to Leroy. He was chosen Employee of the Month and presented as Employees of the Month. So the STAs are near and dear to duck hunters' hearts. I don't have to tell you that we're disappointed in the habitat situation on the STAs, so I'll give you a lead up.
Appreciate that.
The fact of the matter is they're becoming overgrown, and they're no longer the marshes that they used to be, and the large percentage of them have become cattails and other plants that the ducks don't like a lot. So I'm interested to hear this. I was almost a permanent fixture in STA 1 West last Saturday, stepping into a tussock that went up well over almost to my shoulders, which looked like dry land, and I was walking on dry land until I stepped on the tussock, and it took over an hour to dig me out and get me back into the kayak. So these are wonderful places. At one time, we had 3 STAs open for duck hunting. 15% of all the ducks in Florida were shot on those 3 STAs. Someone called me one day and said they'd done an aerial survey, and that something like 25% of all the coots in the whole Atlantic flyway was sitting on the STAs. Was it 25? Well, it was an incredible number of birds. And so to say the duck hunters watch the STAs like a hawk is an understatement. So we look forward to hearing from you, Leroy. Thank you.
Okay, Newton, thank you for the introduction, and appreciate the opportunity to come here today. A quick tip to any potential future presenters: if you're going to talk about vegetation, try not to get yourself on the agenda right behind pythons. That's always a very exciting presentation with a lot of questions, but I'll try to make this somewhat interesting. And again, I'm Leroy Rogers. I'm a section lead in the Land Resources Bureau, and I wear a number of hats, including invasive species, in my work here at the district. I see a lot of you all here that I've worked with on various invasive species issues, but tonight I'm going to talk about STAs and the vegetation management program. I have a team of excellent biologists that are actively out there managing and optimizing the vegetation in the STAs to meet our primary mandate of water quality improvements. And what I hope to do today is just a very brief overview, kind of a high-level review of what it takes to do vegetation management out there, what we're thinking, how we manage it, and then introduce any, answer any questions that you might have, because as Newton said, I know different perspectives, people have different ideas of how we should be managing it. So I'll try to go through as quickly on some pretty complex things here, but let's have a conversation about it, because I'd like to hear others' perspective. I'll start quickly with the mandate here. Most of you know that the Everglades Forever Act directed the South Florida Water Management District in '94 to construct a number of stormwater treatment areas known as STAs. Our primary objective in these large constructed wetlands is to use the biological and physical processes that happen in wetlands to remove excess nutrients from our surface waters coming from urban and agricultural runoff before that water goes into the Everglades. So this is our primary purpose for the STAs. But as Newton had mentioned, and as I think many of you all here know, this has opened up a lot of opportunities for a secondary mandate, which is also in the Everglades Forever Act, to find reasonable, compatible public use in these wonderful constructed wetlands. And shout out to Jerry Krenz and his folks have done a really amazing job working with the public to come up with many great nature-based recreation activities in the STAs. Most popular, of course, is the excellent waterfowl hunting there, but also fishing, gator hunting, bird watching, and I noticed Newton mentioned before, one of my favorites is stargazing, because you get really dark skies out there at night. So a lot of really great activity that happens in there from a public use perspective. This is a very noisy graphic. I apologize, I stole it from another presentation. But my main point here is I just want to, for those of you who might not be familiar with the lay of the land, these are the STAs that since the '94 Everglades Forever Act, these are the STAs south of Lake Okeechobee that we've constructed in the green color there. We have basically 5 clusters of STAs starting just down the road here to the east on Southern Boulevard, STA 1 East and 1 West. Moving south and to the west a little bit, we have STA 2 and the STA 3-4 complex. And then on the other side of Holy Land and Rotenberger WMAs, we have the STA 5-6 complex. And that is getting us over right now 57,000 acres of constructed wetlands for the purposes of water quality treatment. A couple of other things I'll point out very quickly in the map. You see the orange polygons. We're actually actively expanding those STA footprints. The STA 1 West Phase 2, Phase 1 expansion, is nearly complete, and then we'll be looking at the next expansion a little bit south of there. And I'll also point out the very big blue polygon just north of STA 3-4. Many of you already know this. This is the what we call the flow equalization basin, A1FEB. We use these large basins as a way to store big pulses of water after storm events to help attenuate the flow into these STAs. They can easily be damaged if you get too much flow and nutrient loading at one time, like we would commonly see after a major rain event. So these FABs are being built to help sustain these STAs and optimize our performance. Okay, so real quick 101 on how wetlands clean the water. And I know that you all recognize that this is a much more complex process than what I'm trying to show on the graphic here. But just to give you a general idea of what we're doing here with constructed wetlands and using vegetation for that purpose, on the left side of the image you see we have water that's coming into a wetland that is phosphorus rich. It's coming off of a farm or off an urban area. It has a lot of excess nutrients. And the first thing that we want that water to encounter when it comes into one of these wetlands is what we call emergent vegetation. And the classic example of that would be cattail. When we say emergent vegetation, we're talking about plants that are rooted in the ground below the water. They grow through the water and then emerge above the top. That's how it gets its name. Cattail and a number of other species are abundant in the STAs. And while they do, of course, take up phosphorus, both from the roots as well as the vegetation that's in the water column, probably their most important function is to slow the flow. That's one of our big objectives in STAs, is to slow and evenly distribute the water through the STA. Why is that important? It's important because we want the particles that are in the water column to settle out. You reduce the velocities of the water, and we get more water clarity, and that really helps reduce a lot of the phosphorus that's there. Excuse me. A little bit to the right of that in the picture, you see the submerged aquatic vegetation. These are plants like emergents that are rooted in the sediment, but they stay in the water column. And these are very important, especially as the water concentrations of phosphorus get lower. They're very important for sequestration of that phosphorus for the long-term holding in that plant biomass. A third major type of vegetation that we have in the STAs are what we call floating aquatic plants. Water hyacinth is a good example of that. Most of you know that plant. These are plants that are not rooted. They free float on the surface of the water. They do take up phosphorus from the water, but we also find that they very quickly recirculate that phosphorus because the plants decompose very rapidly. So they end up not being a really good long-term sink for what we're trying to do, which is to hold that phosphorus in the sediment. One other point about FAV, the floating aquatic vegetation, is that when it forms dense stands, it will also shade out the sunlight going into the water column, which negatively affects the submerged aquatic vegetation that we're trying so hard to cultivate. So in a gist, those are the three components of vegetation that we're dealing with. Up on the upstream end, we're trying to get emergent plants like cattail. Downstream, we would like more submerged aquatic vegetation, and we consider the floating aquatic to be undesirable, which we try to control. So let's talk a little bit about the basic design principles of STAs and their design. This is a schematic of STA 3-4, one of our biggest STAs. Many of you have been there. And the first thing you see from the schematic, the water's coming in from the north through pump stations, and then it flows through the wetland and then exits south and then goes into the Everglades. And the first thing you see is that they're very compartmentalized. That kind of redundancy, having multiple flowways, gives us a lot of operational flexibility that's very critical for managing these things. They're often in need of some sort of rehabilitation, and the ability to have these multiple flowways to take one or more offline to do some repair is huge for us. And then if I zoom in on one of the flowways, this is the eastern flowway, you can see that we also put in a levee in the middle and further compartmentalized the STA by having individual cells. This is where it becomes important from a veg management perspective. Whoops. As I just mentioned, we like that water to first be introduced to very dense emergent vegetation like cattail. So our objective in those northern cells in a typical scenario would be to cultivate as much of that, as much of that really dense cattail as we can get. Why? Because we want to maximize the distribution of flow, we want to slow the velocity of that water, and we want to get as much sedimentation as possible to treat the water. In the downstream cell of a typical flowway, we have what we manage as called mixed marsh. And I know this is a wonderful place to go waterfowl hunting. A lot of people like to get out in these areas. The old model of STAs was to have emergent in the upstream cell and then all submerged aquatic or SAV vegetation in the south cell. In time, and that's how we used to manage it. If you were a cattail in an SAV cell, you didn't belong. You were considered undesirable there. We learned that Mother Nature's right, and there's a reason that the Everglades is a patchwork of emergent and submerged vegetation. We found very quickly that with wind run up from even just a good steady wind for a couple of days at 15 miles an hour, that water would start to form waves, and then that would lead to a suspension of the sediment. That turbidity in the water now shades out the SAV that we so critically need at that bottom end of the treatment train. And in severe cases, like a tropical system, we would actually uproot a lot of the SAV, and we would end up with an entire cell that needed complete rehabilitation. So we learned that by allowing emergent vegetation to exist in those cells, we were able to still that water, again, get more of an even distribution of flow, and most importantly, protect it from those damaging winds and associated wave run-up. And you'll commonly hear people talk about those as vegetation strips, and you'll see in this next photo why we call them that. This is my favorite flowway of all of our STAs that we manage, and the reason it is because it fits perfectly the prescription that we're trying to manage for. The upstream cell, this is the western flowway at STA 3-4, by the way. The upstream cell is very dense with very thick cattail. We get nice, slow, even flow through there, no preferential flowways where we have little open areas where water can move through more quickly. We have maximum sedimentation. Once that water gets to that middle levee, oftentimes we've reduced the phosphorus concentrations by as much as 50 to 60% of the treatment that we're trying to get. So very important for that. The downstream cell, you can see that characteristic checkerboard pattern. And what you're looking at there, the browner color is vertical and horizontal strips of cattail, where we're compartmentalizing the SAV, which is in the yellowish color in this image. So we've managed to still the water to really and protect that SAV. So this is ultimately what we're looking for. With time, that cattail will start to encroach in those SAV cells, and this is something we're trying to focus on. We want those strips to actually move, and I can't get into a lot of the detail of why that is, but we actually want them to move over time. But then behind that, keep up a significant amount of the SAV. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% SAV, 40% emergent in those cells. I'm going to close off with, I just want to point out one of our biggest challenges that we deal with once we get a cell in good shape and we have the desired vegetation where we want it and we've got the floating aquatics under control like you can see here. One of our biggest challenges is what we call preferential flowways or flow short circuits. This is where any kind of activity, typically it would be an airboat or something like that, that has gone through and crossed a emergent strip parallel to flow. We create a preferential flow, and then with time, and it doesn't take much, it can literally take one or two trips in the same area with an airboat, and suddenly erosion starts to occur, And now the water, instead of evenly moving across that cell, is a lot of that water is now just moving right through that short circuit. And it didn't turn out in the photo here, but you have to trust me, if you could see the original, there's a huge turbidity plume right where that point of that arrow is on that line. What is that doing? Again, it's shading out that SAV, impacting our performance. So once we have the vegetation where we want it, we have to constantly be on the lookout for these short circuits that form. How do we deal with them? We actively plant. And this is a short circuit that was accidentally created by an airboat from some of our folks actually in doing vegetation management work, of all things. And that opened up into a really big open area. And you can't see it unless I put the polygon on, but everything inside those white lines is where we send our contractors in to hand plant emergent plants that were tolerant of those deeper waters in that preferential flowway. And the higher velocities, those would be things like alligator flag, if you know some of these species, and giant bulrush. Eventually that will grow in and have the same kind of resistance to flow as the adjacent cattail, and we get back to that nice even distribution of flow. So this is probably at this point about 50% of the work that we're doing out there right now is just doing this constant repair. I'd like to close with this slide and give a shout out to the hunter community and also again to Jerry Krenz. The photo on the left here is how we used to have access in one particular area in STA 3-4 for duck hunters moving through, and there's a deep water where that access arrow is, so you need to go in with a canoe or a kayak. And you may be able to see that it's parallel, it's right in the same line of the flow that's trying to come out. And on the other side of that yellow arrow is a water quality station and an outflow. We learned quickly that even though we thought maybe a kayak or a canoe wouldn't be a big deal, even that was enough for it to maintain these preferential flowways. So we got with Jerry and all the very cooperative hunters in the hunter community and now have a new strategy where we go perpendicular to the direction of flow in all cells. And in the example of STA 3-4, we now go from the east or the west and not the north or the south. And I have to say that since that's been implemented, we've had zero issues of preferential flow being caused by our public users of the area. And I really appreciate that work that Jerry's done and also the cooperation with our hunter community. It's been great. So I know I went fast, but that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I always have questions. First question, how much of the load, and we're talking phosphorus, phosphates, how much of it's soluble versus settleable coming in and going out?
Well, that's highly variable depending on what's happening upstream, but soluble phosphorus is a very big part of it. Now on the bottom end, the percentage actually increases because a lot of that non-soluble phosphorus has been sequestered into the soil or tied up in the biomass.
I would wager 80% of your phosphorus is
coming in?
Coming in.
Yeah, it's probably that high.
And you note about settling. Do you know how much of your efficiency is due to settling versus uptake of phosphorus?
That's a really good question, and I don't have that answer. I'm not going to be bold enough to just throw an answer out because I'm not 100% sure, but I do know that we do have major reduction once we get to that midpoint where we have our grab samples. So sedimentation is important, but teasing out another component of that sequestration, which is what is cattail doing and other vegetation, plus the algal community, and I didn't even mention this, but because I didn't have time, but we could get into the microbial community. They're a key part of how this phosphorus is sequestered, and there's a lot of that happening on a lot of the epiphytic organisms that grow on the cattail itself. So I haven't teased those apart. I don't know if we have anybody here that's in the research group, but yeah, I'm sure there's a significant amount of it just happening from sedimentation alone.
Okay. I'll put a $100 wager that if you slowed down the water as a pretreatment in the canal through inflatable dams down to a half-foot CFS versus a 2-foot CFS in normal, that you could probably remove half the material coming into your STAs.
I wouldn't make that bet because we've already seen huge improvements in water quality just as we've started to operate the FEBs for that, in large part because of that.
Anybody want to take the bet?
Great presentation. I got a couple of questions, and I'll probably get myself in trouble asking both of them or three or whatever. You don't mention controlled burns in any of your presentation. You don't mention herbaceous growth in any of your presentations. And when God created the Everglades, the Everglades would burn in the dry season, and when the rains came, you'd have herbaceous growth that would come up, and it would grab the natural phosphorus and slow it down. And Newton mentioned earlier that in the STAs, and I'm not an STA expert by any stretch of the imagination, but you have mentioned cattails exclusively through this, and most of us know cattails as curse tails. They take over all other vegetation, and they remove wildlife from vast areas. I just wonder, have you or has the district, where you have the fires like this past year north of the alley, have you ever done any studies about how clean the water is the first season after a burn? Because in my experience, 70 years old, but 60 years of this kind of stuff, the best thing you can do for a big area is burn it and let it come back with herbaceous growth for wildlife, and also to take a ding in noxious plants, which in my estimation cattails are worse than water hyacinths, because they take all the diversity of the vegetation out of an area. And I'm just curious as to why we don't see in this presentation any mention of the natural filtering system, which is cyclical fire.
That's a fantastic question, and being that I started my career as an ecologist working in fire-maintained ecosystems, I'm always thinking about the role of fire. It's a complicated situation, though, in STAs, and let me break this response down in a couple of different ways. The first is the flowway model that I showed you that we're doing. I like to describe that as we're basically taking a model, if you will, of the entire Everglades ecosystem. I'm talking about the Kissimmee River all the way down the lake, down to the Everglades, and trying to model that into a single flowway, right? So if you think about the marshes that are adjacent in the Kissimmee River floodplain, taking that initial thing, think of that as almost analogous to the cattail, right?
I'm real familiar with those, with all of those marshes, all the way to the Everglades.
And then, you get into, if you want to call those mixed marsh cells that we have on the bottom end, almost analogous to what you have in the Everglades, where you have a lot more of the SAV community when the nutrients are lower, because if the nutrients are too high, cattail takes over everything. So we're trying to force a model of a big landscape of wetland ecosystems into one flowway. And the question is, well, then how could fire maybe fit into that? And I've actually raised that question a number of times. We're not there yet. We do actually have a study that is in the queue. The problem is we have limited opportunities often to implement these studies so that we can do compares and do controls, so we understand what effect is actually happening here. But there is some thought that with using fire in STAs in the appropriate way, number one, we could actually help with the health of cattail. In this case, it could actually benefit them, because we all know that fire can regenerate plant communities. It can help with disease control, right? Things like this. But also, it could potentially have a net export of some phosphorus. Phosphorus is not like nitrogen that quickly volatilizes and just goes right to a gas. It stays as a particle. So a lot of the phosphorus goes right back into the STA as ash, but a certain amount of that's going to be carried away in the smoke plume. So that's another potential thing. And it also could open up the stand just enough so that while we still have a dense, even stand of cattail, we might get a little bit more light penetration into that cattail marsh, and benefit some of the algal components that are in the emergent cells. So on paper and thinking about it as an ecologist, it sounds like a great idea, but we haven't yet implemented a study. We have one we want to try in one of the northern STAs real soon, that we will look at that, but If you know anybody that's done prescribed burning, it's actually very complicated to get one off to do them, and you want to do it in just the right conditions so that you don't permanently damage the STA vegetation. So I know that's kind of a long-winded response, but we are interested in that, but it's a really tough one to try to get our head around when we're actively operating the STAs.
Well, I just see it all in privately managed land, on land adjoining the water management district's land, where prescribed burn is carried out every year or at the most every 18 months. The difference in clarity of the water on private lands that have a active prescribed burning versus on the public lands that we recreate on all the time is day and night. And the one missing component in that is prescribed burn.
Right.
And so, I understand it's an expensive process and the staffing in the areas, but when we talk about nutrient load, and, I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but at the head of the Everglades headwater, there is an enormous urbanized area where their only goal is to flush it and get it away, get it out of our county, get it off our property. And when we look at the Everglades headwaters and we see the initial wetlands, where the deterioration of the vegetation in the headwaters strongly points to heavy nutrient load and to a worsening situation. That, to me, is the place where you start. I'm not necessarily talking about the STAs now, but if you can get a better quality water flow south into the STAs, then your job gets a lot easier. In my mind, as just a stakeholder here, you're trying to address this at the outflow, not at the inflow, and where maybe it'd be worth it to the district to try some of this experimentation on some of the stuff at or around Cypress Lake, which is where the velocity starts, and to see if you can't significantly impact what you're trying to deal with here. And that's a place where controlled burns can be easily done because there's no population of people. You're not going to burn down a house.
Right.
That's just my thoughts.
Thank
you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of comments. About 4 years ago, we started putting, I think it's up to 65% of the lake water now that goes south is going through the STAs. Are we still running at about that rate? Lake water going south? 65% going through the STAs, where I know back before that it was a very small percentage.
I don't have the numbers. Again, I'm the vegetation guy, not the operations guy, but I don't know if
Well, the reason I mention that is because the 65% of lake water is going into the SDAs at about at least 120 parts per billion, normally even higher if there's a storm. And before that, it was the SDAs that were designed to take EAA water off the farms. And the water coming off the farms is about 80 parts per billion phosphorus, if I remember correctly. And so what happened was the SDAs were putting water through the system and out the other end at about 18 parts per billion coming out of the SDA into the WCAs. And I believe the figure now with the lake water going through is 28 parts per billion. So we lost about 50% of the efficiency of the SDAs by running lake water through it. And is that still, not being critical, I mean, that came from the political situation of sending the water south. And the district we have to listen to the politicians, and they wanted that water to go south. And if you want to know why we got more cattails in the SDAs, it's because we're putting 120 parts per billion phosphorus water in the SDAs and not 80 parts per billion phosphorus in the SDAs. And in order to knock that 120 down, the only thing that'll do that is cattails. And we all know that. And it's a situation that we're living with. If you go to your WCAs, a WCA 2 or 3 is basically a giant STA. The first top third, 30%, is cattails, as all these guys will tell you. And then you go a little further south and you get mixed vegetation. That's the CL2 that we're talking about here. It's not really rocket science. And then when you get on down a few more miles, guess what? You got beautiful glass marsh. You get down to the bottom end, WCA3, it's beautiful. You go over to Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. Once you get away from the canals a bit and the cattails, it's beautiful. So the STAs are just a microcosm of what we see in the natural swamps. So my question is, the last question, and I'll let you answer, is how long is a sale going to last until the muck is so deep and full of phosphorus that we're going to start losing the STA's efficiency of removing phosphorus? When are we going to have to muck these, that's the right word, I guess, when are we going to have to muck these cells out and start all over again?
Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that question, Newton. That's a really complicated one. And when I first started here, I've been here 20 years roughly, and first started out, I was told, yeah, about 30 to 40 years before we need to worry about that. And, and I don't know who came up with that number or how that was modeled out, but, and this isn't a dodge in any way, but I will say that every flowway, one thing I've learned about the ecology of the STAs is every single flowway is different. There are different histories, land histories that happened before the STAs were built that have legacy effects on the communities and what kind of phosphorus was already there to begin with. There are the effects of the long-term operation of these, and it's a long story of how they got to where they are in the current date. So one flowway could be close to needing to have major work, another one could last 3 times as long, just depending on the history of the flowway. That said, we are seeing that there have already been several cells that either we found that we were no longer getting that net reduction that we wanted. We looked at the phosphorus concentrations in the sediment, and we also looked at the forming variable microtopography, and have spent a significant amount of resources to go in and re-level those out and flatten them, get that good hydraulics going again. And I would imagine, at some point real soon, we'll be looking at the next flowway that we're doing that. The map that I showed originally, where it showed, if I can go back to that real quick, it showed some of the repair work that we were doing. And one big project that we're doing right now in STA 1 East, if I can get up here again, is a flowway that has quite a few issues with stage. Right up here, let me see if I can point it out. Right there in STA 1 East, you see the pink polygon? Right in that area, we're actually going in and regrading and in some cases capping a lot of that phosphorus-rich peat with mineral soil for just that purpose, to kind of reset the STA, if you will.
Now, I want to tell you, I appreciate what all you guys do. I tell you it 100 times. You don't manage STAs for the duck hunters. I mean, it's done because it's under federal court order to take the phosphorus out and get it to, but the whole system, get it down to 10 parts per billion before it gets to the park, and everybody understands that. So, and they are in incredible places when you get away from the cattail parts. And I just want to say it's a complicated thing. I don't think anybody, it's an experimental thing from day one. I mean, we all know that. It's never been done before, and we appreciate it very much. Anybody else have any other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, Newton. Can you go down to your slide number 11, please? And then make a bookmark in your mind there where you show flow short circuit. Go down to number 12. How about 13, because it's outlined in white. Let's go down and make it a little easier. Is there a water depth difference? What's the difference in water depth outside the white line and inside the white line?
Once a good short circuit is formed, we can, depending on what caused it and what kind of velocities we've experienced, we can see anything from 6 inches difference between baseline elevation to even up to 1.5 feet in some of the deeper zones.
So back in slide 11, your flow short circuit. And I want to make, so the only vessels in STAs, there's no public vessels in it, right?
No, sir, these, the only vessels would be, that the district has is airboats.
How many airboats are you running in at STA?
You know, it's variable depending on what's happening. If there are a lot of, if there's a lot of planting going on, we have to move our contractors that end up waiting out in the wetland, but they have to carry all the plant material that they're planting. They'll use airboats for that. So if we're actively doing a project, there could be out an airboat in the cell every day. There's a lot of research-related monitoring that goes on. Not a lot of airboat activity, but it does happen. But, you know, every STA is going to be different. There might be some cells that have an airboat every day. Some maybe don't see one for months.
So the lack of vegetation there between both sides of that white line, the green vegetation there, you're saying, based on what you said a minute ago, there's not a significant amount of water depth difference there. It's not feet, it would be inches?
Well, right there, it's actually not a big difference in that particular spot, but it doesn't take much of a difference in elevation to create those flowways and to have a lot of flow go through there. In that case, at that particular site, there happens to be some rocky material at depth there, and it's kind of kept it from getting too deep, but it will, you still will see a lot of preferential flow bypassing the rest of that cell because of that short circuit.
The rocky material then is within that flow short circuit?
Yeah, below the peat, there was some material there.
And does that exist either side of that short circuit, the rocky material also?
Just to the north and just to the south of it, yeah, so up on the top and on the bottom.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, anyone else? Yes, young man, come to the mic. We need you to come, just, no, just come up
It
to.
won't be captured.
You have to do it on the mic because the people on the air cannot hear you. And I will get complaints from this lady right here.
When you speak of demucking the STAs, I know you've done that number 5 right now. The old entrance has been completely pulled out. What happens with the muck? What do you do with all that phosphorus-rich mud? That you
Yeah,
have?
that's a good question. In most cases that we've done it, we haven't had a lot of material that's ended up coming out. A lot of it just gets redistributed and then either capped or just gets filled into the low spots. But when it does come out, we typically stockpile it nearby. There's not a lot of use that we can have because a lot of times it's very, all kinds of things like atrazine and other compounds could be in there, especially if there's a lot of agricultural runoff. It might not be something that we can just readily send off, to give away as a commodity, if you will.
Hey, I just think long-term that this is going to be your number one issue that you have with these STAs, and you talk about the cattails, and that's part of the phosphorus, but they're not removing the phosphorus. They're trapping in the soil, and it's going to be a big issue for the state to deal with in long-term. So maybe mechanical removal or some other ways, maybe fire, some other ways of looking at it, but it should be looked at.
No, I appreciate that, and you're absolutely right. On the long-term horizon, the end game is that we're sequestering nutrients and a lot of it in that peat, and eventually that peat's going to get to an elevation where we have to do something about it. Absolutely right.
Okay. SDAs are always a interesting and popular
So
subject.
managed to make it as interesting as pythons. Good job.
And Leroy, we will be asking you back. All right, anyone else? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. Yeah, good job.